Madeline Bocaro describes herself as a passionate fan of rock and roll. In this episode of the Plutopia podcast, she explains her passion for all things rock and roll. We also explore her ultimate biography of Yoko Ono, In Your Mind, the Infinite Universe of Yoko Ono.
Well, I just saw a picture of her in a magazine in 1967. It was a picture of her in front of a frame of one of her films. And I just thought, this person has a kind of a mischievous look. She looks kind of interesting, and her film was about bottoms, on the screen walking. And I said, well, this is kind of cool. And I kept the picture, and the following year I realized, hey, this is the person that's with John Lennon. So I was so happy because now I'm like, wow, I'll really find out what she's doing now. And sure enough, they end up getting married and doing all their events together, the Bed-ins for Peace, everything they did. They were on the news every day practically. So I started collecting everything she ever, all the interviews she ever did, all her music, all her TV interviews I would record off the TV. And I've been writing about her all my life.
Hey, welcome everybody to yet another edition of the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm John Lebkowski, and my partner in crime here is Scoop Sweeney. And today we'll be interviewing Madeline Bocaro, a New York author and journalist with deep knowledge about rock and roll. And we always look forward to a discussion of rock and roll. And we will especially be talking about Madeline's new book about Yoko Ono, which is called The Infinite Universe of Yoko Ono. In Your Mind, The Infinite Universe of Yoko Ono. And it's quite a read. Encyclopedic, I would say.
Pretty much biblical, I would say. People are calling it the Bible of Ono. It's just that it's over 500 pages, but it needs to be because the woman is 91 years old. She had such an incredible life in so many aspects, an intense ancestry of born in one of the wealthiest families in Japan. And then she has this very lonely childhood during the war, where she's evacuated and starving, and people don't know most of the story. And then of course she's traveling as an avant-garde artist. She meets John Lennon. There's the Beatle problem. There's the FBI chasing John and Yoko. It's endless.
And I recall you saying that you couldn't really find a publisher who would publish the full length of the book. So you decided to self-publish, is that correct?
Yeah, I had to do it because everybody said you have to cut this in half. And they said maybe do 2 parts, but I'm like, who's going to buy the second half when, John is no longer with us and they don't want to hear. But it is all inclusive of John. John never left Yoko. She's still, perpetuating his legacy and talking about him constantly.
So before we talk more about Yoko, I want to ask about your involvement in dedication to rock and roll. One thing I saw was that you have a connection to Sparks. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, I've loved them since I was 13, and I went to their concerts in the 70s, and later on I connected with them on I guess it was their AOL message board back in the day, and I told them about my fandom, and they asked me to start writing their newsletter because they liked my writing. And I've been doing that for over 20 years. And Ron and Russell are like great friends of mine now. It's the best. Travel with them a lot.
And you're still doing that?
Yeah, I just did the 8 shows in the UK of the last tour last summer. So they're still going strong.
Yeah, those guys are amazing. I was listening to their latest album the other day, and they're as strong as ever.
Working on a new one too.
Yeah, I got turned
So
on.
was Spark?
I got turned on their music back when I was working as a music editor in San Francisco, but a radio news service, and I played it for some of the classic rock friends of mine, and they were just horrified. It's like, well, that's just too weird. And it's like, I think the song, I was trying to remember the song, this town ain't big enough for the two of us,
Both of us. Yeah.
both for the both of us. And they were offended, but I've loved their stuff ever since. I still play it on some of my internet radio stations that I host and get a big response.
Well, there's a new documentary on them called The Sparks Brothers, directed by Edgar Wright, and that came out a year or two ago, and it gained them so many new fans. And the tagline on the film is your favorite band's favorite band, because there's all these musicians talking about how much they loved them growing up.
Edgar Wright is the perfect director for that too.
Oh yeah.
So was that sort of your introduction to rock and roll, or were you already jamming along before you discovered Sparks?
Well, before Sparks, it was, the Beatles on itself, and I was only 6, but I saw the excitement there and then started buying all the Beatles records. And along the way, with Alice Cooper and David Bowie. And then, I actually had the Beatles' White Album when I saw a picture of Yoko for the first time. And that's when I realized she was with John Lennon, and started following her ever since then. And then from Bowie, I got, Lou Reed, the New York Dolls, all the glam, and then later the punk, Ramones, Sex Pistols, everything. Luckily, I was very young when I got into it, so I still got to see a lot of it in the 70s and 80s. So I write about all that.
And what was your start as a journalist?
I started at CMJ. It was a college media journal in the late 70s, and they would collect all the music charts and reports of college radio, what they were playing on. And that was cool because it was really like indicative of what people were listening to. And I was writing for them, doing reviews, concert reviews, record reviews. And then I went off on my own a little bit. And then my parents moved to Florida, and I had to get a job that was more steady than just writing. But I always wrote on the side, just feature articles for different publications. And I was always consulted whenever it came to like an artist that I was pretty much a expert on. So, and then I started my blog. So I was a completely independent.
I was looking through your Facebook page, and you celebrate a lot of a diverse array of artists. And that impresses me because I encounter a lot of people, they're either one way or another. They have one band and they won't even listen to anything or acknowledge the existence of other groups. And the Beatles are that way. I've encountered a lot of Beatles fans who are either all over, they love them all, or they only appreciate one Beatle.
Yeah, people are funny. I think I'm pretty limited actually, because I don't go into a lot of the new music. I'm really stuck in the 70s and a little bit into the 80s, but I love all the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, all the rock, the great stuff from the 70s that we're still listening to, that young people are discovering still. So who knows what the music of the 2000s is going to be, how long that's going to last, but I know that the stuff I love has some merit.
So what are your thoughts about the state of rock and roll today?
It's funny because it's the same bands that are still on tour, and they're almost 90, and they're the ones that are household names still, and there's no new household names. That's the problem, I don't think. I mean, we've got Def Leppard, right, on tour. He's one of my good friends, Joe, and he was saying that him and U2 are like the last two that really caught on people's tongues and everybody knows. But later on, I mean, you got Pearl Jam and all that, but worldwide, are they going to be playing 40 years from now? We don't know.
Yeah, I thought it was cool to see like the Zombies. The Zombies are still touring, they're still playing, they're still going strong. There was a documentary about them recently too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like how long does that it must be 50 plus years that they've been on like playing together with a break. I think they took a long break. There's a lot of bands that stopped playing together and then they came back together again.
Right. I mean, this is their life.
Like they do a reunion.
They can't do anything else, and be happy. It's good for the fans that they keep touring. It's great.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to see the Rolling Stones on tour, considering how long they've been doing it and how old they are. I guess it does my heart good to see that those guys are still out there and they're still doing it.
Yeah, the new album's really good. I reviewed it on my blog. It's MadelineX.com, Madeline, X as in X-ray.com. You know, I find nothing wrong with it. It's fantastic.
It's kind of an amazing album, and of course, they're an amazing band. I'm going to show, for the benefit of people who see this on YouTube, I'm going to display your blog,
Cool.
and I see something about McCartney there, and certainly some things about the Stones, Sly Stone,
Yeah.
um,
Iggy Pop's a
Iggy
big
Pop,
one. Yeah.
Blondie, yeah, Pee Wee Herman,
Come to his show.
fantastic.
Yeah,
I kind of like the way your blog is put together here.
yeah, I love
It really makes me want to jump in.
And then there's some playlists. I make these themed playlists, like that one you saw. I said "Fooling Around" was an April Fool's Day list. I'm going to come out with a Mother's Day playlist of songs about mothers. I'll do a Father's Day one, and they're fun. I put fun facts about all the songs and links to them all.
Where do you post
Excellent.
your, do you have the playlists on something like Spotify or?
I'm not that swift, but I could put YouTube links to all the stuff, and a lot of it is video too. So live performances. So I like to have those.
Yeah, I have a habit of putting together playlists and occasionally sharing them.
Well, it's
And
not just a list.
it
It's
hadn't
really
really
a
occurred to me to
story
do
about the
this.
song. And then it's like a mixtape for the internet, like, but why not, delve into the songs and find out the connections between them and more details.
Yeah, I like putting my mixtapes onto, I have two internet radio stations because I just love, playing music for people and have a rather large collection. A lot of it most of it, in fact, is vinyl. And have you gotten into the vinyl renaissance? Because that's become the biggest selling, one of the biggest selling formats now compared to CDs.
Yeah, I wish I had a bigger living space because I still have about my 500 albums from, that I collected before I moved here. And I will buy an occasional vinyl of my favorite album if it's got something different on it or some great packaging. But other than that, I don't. I have it all. And, I actually still listen to my iPod because I like my own playlists.
Yeah, the iPod is a little more convenient. You don't have to lug around a bunch of big speakers and turntables. So it's an easier way to get around with your music.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm totally digital. Um, Sometimes I feel bad about it. I really should get a turntable. But the quality of digital streaming is so much better now than it was years ago. It seems to be an acceptable way to take music. And you can listen to anything, pretty much anything you've ever heard is available online, including Yoko. Several of Yoko's albums. I did discover there was an album of hers that I couldn't find online, but she's pretty much out there. There's a number of them available, and of course, also the work that she did with John Lennon is all online. What led you to Yoko? How did you meet her? How did you decide to write this sort of encyclopedia of Yoko?
Well, I just saw a picture of her in a magazine in 1967. It was a picture of her in front of a frame of one of her films. And I just thought, this person has a kind of a mischievous look. She looks kind of interesting. And her film was about bottoms, on the screen walking. And I said, well, this is kind of cool. And I kept the picture. And the following year, I realized, hey, this is the person that's with John Lennon. So I was so happy because now I'm like, wow, I'll really find out what she's doing now. And sure enough, they end up getting married and doing all their events together, the bed-ins for peace, everything they did. They were on the news every day practically. So I started collecting everything she ever, all the interviews she ever did, all her music, all her TV interviews I would record off the TV. And I've been writing about her all my life, pretty much, like for my blog, for Facebook group, for friends, just to explain a particular artwork or whatever. And during COVID, my boyfriend gave me software and he said, put all your Word documents in here and see what you have. And I realized I had pretty much a book. So it took me another 2.5 years to flesh it out and, organize it and write a forward and an afterword and really finesse it. And it's amazing. It all fit into place. And I had access to interviews that were very well hidden and underground, things that I'd saved from magazines that don't exist anymore. And I was the only one who could have really done this because I knew what was important about her and what to bring forth.
Yoko was a victim of a lot of cruel commentary from some so-called Beatle fans. And I was reading through your Facebook page for the Yoko universe, and you did an interesting comparison of her and Linda McCartney being subjected to the same kind of abuse. Of course, Yoko was subjected to a lot worse. But can you explain that comparison there?
Yeah, if I could, actually, I could probably find that somewhere. But yeah, it's just that, first of all, most of the stuff directed at Yoko is based on lies. A lot of these early Beatle fans were used to John with the blonde wife and son, and Cynthia was a wonderful person. But, she and John were attracted to each other because they were opposites. She was posh and quiet and intelligent, and he was just this rough and tough rocker trying to hide his sensitivity pretty much. And when he met Yoko, they were exactly the same as each other. They were both highly intelligent. They were bored by most people because they had so many ideas that they wanted to get out, which they couldn't really be understood on their own. And when they got together, they were sort of invincible. They understood each other completely. They nurtured each other. And of course, they had their problems. They were codependent, and they ended up doing drugs because of all the stuff that was hurled at Yoko from everyone, including the Beatles. But I think it was one of the deepest love stories ever. So I don't know.
Well, they were both sort of isolated, weren't they? I mean, he was isolated by fame, and she was isolated for a number of reasons that go all the way back to her childhood.
Right. She was raised by servants as a child. She was the firstborn, so she didn't have siblings for the first several years. And the servants were told not to really address her because she was their superior and they couldn't, play with her, or it was terrible. She had no physical connection to anyone. Her father was away on business in America. She didn't meet him till she was almost 3 years old. Her mother was a socialite, wasn't very affectionate. Then they were both children of war as well. She was evacuated to the countryside, and when she returns to Tokyo, it's completely bombed out, because you imagine being 12 years old and this is your life. So she went through that, and John was going through the parental abandonment as well. His mother had given him to his aunt to raise him. His father went away to sea, and they had this similar loneliness. And when they met, it was like full on. It's like, oh my God, here's my other half.
Yeah, I thought a lot of that abuse that was aimed at Yoko was rooted in just racism. And I was a music editor back in the 70s for a radio news service, and I would get submissions from freelance correspondents, and a couple of them that I'd put on the do not fly list of correspondence, because they sent in these horribly racist analyses of why Yoko was with John and why people don't like Yoko. And it was just horrible. I mean, these were supposedly adult and professional writers, and they just zeroed in on the fact she was Asian and John should have stayed with the blonde, as you said.
Right. Right. So this is the problem. And then, there's the comparison I was making with Yoko and Linda. It's right here. I wrote this little piece that I put up on Facebook to just show people. I wrote, an intelligent and creative woman from a wealthy family attended Sarah Lawrence College in New York. She had been married with a young daughter. She divorced, then married one of the Beatles. They were inseparable. Because of this, she faced ridicule, blame, and cruel discrimination. After the Beatles broke up, she encouraged her husband to tour with his own band. Her husband insisted that she be in the band as well. He wrote many songs about her. They worked together to create a better world. I am referring to both Linda McCartney and Yoko Ono. These are only a few of the parallels in their lives. The difference is that there was more cruelty directed toward Yoko. The media was not kind to Linda, but the blatant lies that they spread about Yoko were exceptionally hurtful. So here you have it.
Oh, wow.
Linda
That's
encourages
amazing.
to form Wings. Yoko encourages John to do Plastic Ono Band. They're on stage with their husbands. And, Linda got a little flack too, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what Yoko got.
Yeah, I mean, Yoko was accused of breaking up the Beatles, but if you watch the Get Back documentary that Peter Jackson created a couple of years ago, you see Yoko in that setting, like the Beatles were working together, and Yoko is kind of there with John, and she seems to be, if nothing else, just contributing,
Even she's like knitting.
trying to help with the process.
She's just, whispering to John a little bit, but it's nothing like it was made out to be. In fact, when John told Yoko he was going to leave the group, she said, well, what am I going to do? What's he going to be preoccupied with while I do my work? Because she was an independent artist. She didn't collaborate with anyone. And she was thinking, well, I'm in love with this guy, but, he has his thing and I have my thing, and we'll probably just work on our own. But nope, he left the Beatles and they went into step with each other and just started collaborating, which she didn't think could happen, but she was happy that it did.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that when Yoko met John, she had no idea what a Beatle was.
Yeah, I mean, in Japan, she was born in 1933. So she was a teenager in the 40s. There was no such thing as even rock and roll. So she's not there with a turntable and posters on her walls. She's in what was there in the 30s and 40s. And not only that, she was into avant-garde music. She was into sound more than music. And she was hearing Japanese sounds, which is kabuki and no theater, and even Okinawan music, and think that she was listening to were way out there. And so when she was in London in 66, and her husband then was her promoter, he's the one that brought her to that Indica gallery. And he's the one that told John Dunbar, let's have a show here. I would love the Beatles to be interested in Yoko's work. And she's going, oh, are they really that important? Like, she didn't know. And people do not believe her. I don't see why not.
Well, I do. I mean, early on when I first heard of Yoko, obviously I learned of Yoko through her connection with John and with the Beatles, but it was clear that she was an artist in her own right, and that she had her own thing, her own career, and that she was not, just like an attachment to John. And I always thought that it was a kind of a terrible thing that people who perceived her in that way. They perceived her as being an adjunct to John Lennon, or
Right.
she was somehow overshadowed by.
She pursued him and stalked him. But I have a quote from her. It says, that's not my way of doing things. I wasn't that intent on connecting with him. Women send me letters saying, oh, it's beautiful to know that you were so forceful. But I went to Paris after we met, and I thought I would never go back to London. I didn't want a relationship at the time. I wanted freedom from my work. And I don't like the idea that I'm creating a situation where women think they have to stalk a man to get them. That's really serious. don't stalk them. It seemed like the wrong situation at the wrong time. I was already aware that there was an entourage looking at me, like, what are you trying to do? And I thought, I'm not trying to do anything. Leave me out of this. It's like something told me this is bad news, and it was. So, they both had this force field, they were both married, they both had children, and they were trying to avoid this kind of union, but it couldn't be avoided. They were too attracted to each other.
So it just, however, they might have tried not to make some kind of union, they couldn't avoid it. How did they reach the point where they realized that they had to be together?
Well, it was a while, it was a little while after. They ran into each other at different events in London and they said hello, but they didn't really connect. But then Yoko, as she said, went to Paris. She did an event with Ornette Coleman over there. And John was meditating with the Beatles in India. He was thinking of bringing Yoko instead of Cynthia, but he realized that couldn't be arranged. And Yoko was going to stay in Paris, but a bunch of other artists were going back to London and she went with them. And she got back to her apartment. She found a stack of letters from John. And she had been sending him a few things from where she was. And she just realized, oh, this is it. And then they got together.
So we've mentioned that she was an artist and John was a musician, but she was also a creator of music. Did she ever play an instrument or what? I know that she worked with John Cage and others and that she had been married to a composer.
Right.
Her first husband.
Married to Toshi Itsunagi. He was a very famous Japanese avant-garde composer later on through his life. He only died 2 years ago and he was still working, still revered over there. Yoko, as I said, she was into sound. What she was doing with John Cage was peripheral. She wasn't, she was laying across the piano or they were banging noises, things like that. What she did with Ornette Coleman it was called emotional modulation, the piece, and she instructed the members of the band how to play. So it was really her participation in that was verbal. But she was classically trained in piano. She was, as a young child, she was taught musical notation. And one of her assignments was to create the sounds of the birds singing. And she was literally writing this in musical notes on a paper, but she realized, wait a minute, there's too much here. You can't recreate this. There's something wrong with the way we score musical notation. So she just wrote on the musical staff, play with the accompaniment of the birds singing at dawn. She used words to describe what it should sound like. And when she would listen to a clock ticking, she would hear the silences between the ticking. She had a very unique mind. She thought in 6 dimensions, 7 dimensions. She was really, really complex out there. And that's what John was fascinated by, her thought process.
The one time I ever saw Yoko perform music, she reminded me, I kept thinking of John Coltrane. She was doing vocals that to me were equivalent to what John Coltrane did with the saxophone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she didn't
And I
really
can
start
imagine
doing
her.
a lot of music until John put her with Ringo and Klaus Vormann for what became her first album, this jam. And it's called Yoko Ono Plastic Ono Band. It was the companion piece to John's first solo album. It's very raw and primal, but it's really getting recognition for how fantastic it is and how way ahead of its time. And even Sean, her son, says, she goes from not knowing anything about rock and roll to inventing punk rock. So it's brilliant.
Well, redirecting just a little bit, one thing that about Yoko's life that really always affected me was her search for Kyoko. And she married Anthony Cox and had the child and searched for a long time. Actually had encountered a few journalists who are actually actively searching for Kyoko as well, but they never really got to find her until what was 1998? Was that when Yoko?
Oh yeah, Kyoko contacted Yoko in the 90s. So yeah, I mean, listen, what it was, the just like John eventually ended up raising Sean, her first husband raised Kyoko. Because Kyoko was busy, with the work. So the guy was very close with the child. And when John Lennon comes into the picture, uh, he first tried to be kind of like friendly with him as much as he could, but he just saw John as a big threat in a way, like this girl is gonna go with him, right? So he kidnaps the kid, takes her into a religious cult, and he was in search of God himself. And I actually have a quote from Tony Cox. He made a documentary in 1986 about this cult that he left. And he wrote, I grew up with the whole scene. I was a beatnik. I was a hippie. I went through the whole drug trip. I was taking acid when you could get acid for free. I took my first mescaline and acid before one word had been written about it. I took a lot of acid thinking things were going to improve my mind. And it took me years to discover the opposite. And I don't have any bitterness toward Yoko. We made terrible mistakes. Although Yoko and John nearly destroyed me at the same time, Yoko really had a tremendous remorse. And when I found out that later, it changed my whole attitude. I really felt sorry for her. Regardless of how much I suffered, she was suffering also. So, it's just all so, if they had just sat down and spoken and worked this out and had joint custody, it would have been so much better for everybody. But they were just, listen, they were in their late 20s, maybe, Yoko was a little older, but on drugs and all, and couldn't think rationally. So he runs off with the kid and it ruined a lot of lives.
Well, John and Yoko were pretty wealthy and powerful, and I'm sure that was intimidating that he felt that if they wanted to, they could totally take Kyoko and push him right out of the picture. But he seems like a pretty fascinating guy. I didn't realize until I read some of what you'd written how interesting a life Tony Cox had had. Is he still around? Is he
He's
still alive
Yeah,
today?
he's in his 80s. Yeah.
Yeah. Has he written about his life?
No, as I said,
I
he
know
wrote
that
a
he made the
documentary
one.
in 1986,
Yeah.
just about the cult and leaving and all. But the daughter Kyoko has my book, and that's all that matters. It's great. Sean loves it. He's very supportive. I mean, this is what it was written for
How's
people who know her to learn more.
how's her relationship with Yoko now?
Great. Fantastic. She has 2 grandchildren now. It's wonderful.
And Sean too. I mean, I guess they're all
Oh yeah.
connected
Big
and
family.
without constraint now. Yeah. Sean led the band when I told you that I'd seen her perform. She performed at South by Southwest in, I think it was 2011. And Sean put a band together for her. And it was kind of an amazing thing, you know. I mean, uh, he's a very accomplished musician in his own right. And, his support for her and I mean, the love between them, it was just such an obvious thing in the way that they were working together in that performance.
Well, Sean's her biggest fan. I mean, I met him when he was about 8 years old. I was up front at a concert in Toronto. No, was it Montreal? And me and my friends were up front going crazy because Yoko was doing her old songs and it was wild. And we were backstage and Sean comes running up going, oh my God, I saw you guys rocking out. I'm like, Sean, oh my God, this is the greatest night. And I said, what's your favorite album? And he said, Yoko Ono, Plastic Ono Band. I'm like, oh my God, this kid is too good. He's gonna do right by her. And sure enough, he became her musical director. He got his Japanese musician friends to form the band for her Ima in 86, and they did a nice tour. And he released her vinyls, and repackaged and remastered all those. So I don't know what she would do without him.
Does she still perform at all?
No, the last time she performed was probably, I can't think of the year, but like 2014. She's not really well, she's in a wheelchair and her health isn't good. So that's pretty much. He's winding it down.
So, how did you go from being a fan and a person really interested in Yoko to actually kind of meeting her and having a relationship with her?
Well, I was writing to her when I was, 1973, when they moved to the Dakota and I had an address. I would write her letters, and she could tell I was a kid writing to her, probably because I was saying, oh, I wanted to come to your concert, but I can't, I'm not old enough to get into the club. But she would write back, and then I started writing to her more when after John was killed. Um, and one day my friend told me, I think Yoko needs to meet you. And I was like, well, I never thought of that. She said, well, I used to go to the Dakota all the time and see John and Yoko come out, and I get their autographs and everything. So let's just go see her. We'll go on her birthday so she knows you're there for her, and we'll see what happens. So I went and I brought her a present, and within 5 minutes she came out, and I gave her the present, told her who I was. She's like, oh my God, it's you. And it was as if she knew me all my life. She was like, listen, I'm having this exhibition of John's work next week. You have to come to this. And then I have this and that and the concert. And we kept up, correspondence. And she just loved the fact that I would speak about her own music and work with her. I never mentioned the Beatles. It was just always questions about what she was doing and observations. And she was very happy that I was perceiving her messages and her work, and just couldn't be more loving and wonderful. You just see why John loved her when you spend time with her. She's like magical.
That's amazing that she is that open to the to fans. A lot of performers are just the opposite. They get the letters and they have an assistant answer to them with some stock, thank you for the letter and go away,
Well,
basically.
she
But
answered every letter. Even right when John was killed, she got a letter from a girl that said, John was killed on my birthday. And she felt horrible. And she wrote back to this girl and she said, well, don't think of it as the day that John died. Think of it as the day his soul was set free to travel the universe. And she kept sending this girl a birthday card every year for decades on what was the most horrible anniversary of her own life. And she was thinking of this girl every year. So this is Yoko. She just tried to heal the world. That's all she was doing. She's just a humanitarian, and she gets the opposite reputation, which is so unfair.
So I'd like to go back a little bit to a period that I never have completely understood and have always been really interested in, which was when they broke up for like 18 months. Do you have much insight into what was going on, why they chose not to be together for that period of time?
Yeah, well, John was his work wasn't being well received. They did a concert at Madison Square Garden, which was the Sometime in New York City album concert. And it was fantastic. I was there. But it got panned. The FBI was trailing John. He was getting paranoid. They were bugging his phones. They were trying to deport him because he was associating with the hippies and the yippies and the radicals of the time. And when Nixon won the election, he went off the deep end. He was drunk and he went into another room at a party where Yoko was and started making love to another girl. So that was the straw. And Yoko just said, look, we need time apart. You go. And she took their assistant aside, May Pang, and she said, May, you need to go with John. And May claims that she was against it. And she said, I don't want to be with your husband. And Yoko said, look, just go. But basically, this was a wife sending her husband off with someone she could trust, because even if they had an affair, which she knew they probably would, it would be better than 10 other women writing books about it later on. So she made sure that John was protected and with someone he could trust. They happened to go to LA and meet up with his drinking buddies. And he got into a lot of trouble. And he was
Harry Nilsson.
Harry Nilsson, Keith Moon,
Yeah.
Alice, all of them. And, John claims that it was hell. May Pang claims that it was the best years of John's life because he was away from Yoko. So, it's just crazy, but he ended up going back to Yoko, and that's where
Yeah,
he's.
I think his music suffered during that period. He did the Phil Spector album, what was it, Rock and Roll, and in that period. And I liked some of the stuff off of it, but it didn't have that same, John Lennon feel as when he was with Yoko. It just, it's obvious he was missing something in his creative process.
Well, also in 1973 was when they split, and he made Mind Games. And a lot of the songs on there are beautiful, songs of apology to Yoko, like I Sumasen and Out the Blue and You Are Here, all these songs, and Walls and Bridges had a few as well. So, you know, it was what it was, and they got back together with the help of Paul McCartney, which most people don't know. Paul's the one that asked Yoko, what's going on? Why are you separated? And she said, well, this is what happened. And Paul said, well, do you want him back? Like, are you gonna? And she said, only on my terms, only if he courts me and dates me and works his way back again. So Paul said, can I go? And I have the actual quotes from this in the book. It's all, he's like, is it all right if I go to LA and tell him this? And she said, yeah. So Paul did it. And that's when John worked his way back.
How long did that take?
Not too long. I mean, he came back and, to do that concert with Elton John in November of 74. And by February, they were together. And within 9 months, Yoko had John.
At the age of 42, which is interesting. It's unusual to have a child at that age.
Right. She did it because
It must have been difficult.
Yeah, it very really was. She had to have blood transfusions, and the doctors were asking for his autograph, and he was screaming. It was a nightmare. Everything in his life was a nightmare. But eventually they had their few years of peace. They spent summers in Japan, in the final 3 years before they did Double Fantasy. They were planning on touring the album, go in Japan, in places they had never been. It was going to be amazing. And then
when Double Fantasy came out, any fan of John and Yoko was just delirious, because I remember getting my review copy in it, and it's like, wow, this is great. And the joy didn't last all that long, unfortunately.
Right. It was a matter of weeks. Yeah. Terrible.
Well, and when John was killed, was murdered outside the Dakota, what was that like for her? That must have been an incredibly traumatic time.
Of course. She wouldn't have gone on if it wasn't for having Sean. I mean, after a few days, she came out of seclusion and she said, listen, I've got to just raise this child. And right away, she went back into recording. She finished the song that they had been working on the night he was killed, Walking on Thin Ice, put it out as a single. And John had predicted that that would be her first #1, and it was decades later as a dance hit. So yeah, and then a year later, she released the album Season of Glass. She just had to channel it all into her work.
Has she had another relationship with anyone since John's passing?
Well, everybody says that she moved this guy Sam in the day after John died and had this long-term affair. But what it was is, Sam was a friend of both John and Yoko. He's an artist as well. He's from Budapest. He had the same kind of background as Yoko, fleeing a war-torn country, and they were very close. And Yoko really saw right away that she needed someone to raise Sean. Nobody was going to replace John, but this was her thing. Sean was very close to Sam at the time. Sam was a wonderful guy. I met him several times, and he has nothing but great things to say about Yoko. He calls her a one-woman university course. He learned so much from her, has no bitterness toward her. It's just they drifted apart once Sean was 18 and went away to school. And that was it. And he went off to Budapest. He's a renowned artist there now. And people make this whole thing up in their heads, how, she replaced John, which She didn't.
I don't think you could really replace John.
She would have remarried if
Irreplaceable.
she wanted to, have another affair or something, but that's what it was.
Yeah, she continued to honor John's memory. I know she had the John Lennon Museum in Japan, which was
Yeah,
open.
I went to that one in Yokohama. It's closed now, but that was fantastic.
Yeah, and she's done, what was it, a competition for a BMI Foundation to give support to songwriters of contemporary music.
Yes.
It was all in honor of John's memory and his creative legacy. And I think it said in her Wikipedia that $350,000 was given to BMI for the John Lennon scholarships.
Sure. She has
And
the educational tour bus in his name. She has so many things going on for him. I don't know how she has time to do her own work. It consumes her life. She sits with the engineers when they're remastering all of his work for the 50th anniversary box sets. Mind Games is coming out this summer. And, she makes sure it's exactly how John would have wanted it.
I assume that's not Giles Martin who's doing that re-engineering. Is she
I
working
don't
with a
know.
different
It's
set
Sean
of
working with
engineers?
Yoko and the engineers. Nothing to do with Charles Martin. That's Beatles stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder when are those remasters going to be released?
Which Mind Games?
Yeah, Mind Games, and
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be July or something.
I know that on I guess the last album she did, she included her own version of Imagine. Am I right about
Oh
that?
yeah, I'm at Warzone. Uh-huh. She did a recreations of a lot of her other songs and Imagines. Yeah.
And there was something about how she was a little uncertain whether she should do that, or a little not completely comfortable with the idea of like creating or releasing her own version of it, but she did do it.
Hmm. Yeah, she used to perform it
And
live as well. Sometimes she did it at Amnesty International. People give her hell for everything.
well, and when she re-recorded it and re-released it, the authorship shown was John Lennon and Yoko Ono. So I don't
Right,
think
because
that
she
orig
she was credited in 2017 for co-writing.
and that she wasn't originally credited, but I mean, that song is a manifestation of her, right?
Right. Well, that's why my book is called In Your Mind, because it's everything, all of her artwork is conceptual and it's about you completing it in your mind. And in her book, Grapefruit, a lot of the instructions are imagine, imagine, imagine. And that's where he got that from. And during the ceremony, the award ceremony where she was given credit for the song, there's a tape of John saying, when we recorded this, I was too macho to put her name on there, but she definitely, had a hand in everything I did, regarding that song. So there it is.
So what is she? Well, one thing I'm aware of that she did quite a bit, and I don't know to what extent gets acknowledgement, but I know that she was considered a very good businesswoman, and that she managed the business affairs of John Lennon and his estate.
Mhm.
Is she very preoccupied with that to this date?
To this day, I don't know. I mean, she's handed down some of the responsibilities because of her health, but um, her family was a big time banking family that descended from her billionaire great grandfather. And her sister, when the father died, her sister kind of took over that part of the family business, and then also became an artist when John encouraged her to. So Yoko kind of had it in her blood, I suppose, um, to she didn't particularly love to do it, but John's finances they were a mess. So she invested in things that they loved. Um, and it was prosperous. She collected a lot of Egyptian art. She invested in livestock and homes that were beautiful and meant a lot to them. And she really had a knack for it. And she'd go to the Apple business meetings while she was eating an apple. Like just to, that's her, she's playful like that. So she really learned the lawyer language and went with the flow. And she said it was kind of like a chess game, and she learned how to play the game.
She was one of the founders of the Coda collection, and I just read about that. And is that still an ongoing project of getting documentaries and concert films supported?
The Dakota collection? What do you mean?
Coda, CODA, the Coda
Oh,
collection.
Coda.
Yeah,
Yeah.
along with Amazon Prime Video channels.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's an ongoing thing. I mean, I don't know how involved she is with it anymore, but I remember Coda gathering everything. They're making like a digital catalog.
Yeah, she seems to have an interest in pretty much everything involving creation of art and music and politics. I just I've, before our interview, I was just reading through her Wikipedia, and it just goes on and on and on, and it's like it sounds like the summation of a crowd of people, but it's just this one, incredible woman.
Yeah. I mean, she probably worked every day of her life since she was, let's say, 19, when she started writing. Well, she was 4 when she was writing little poems and instructions and things, but, probably every day of her life till she was 90. So with and without John, in every medium, art, film, activism, feminism. Her great-grandmother was a pioneering feminist. So she had it in her blood too. And she just cares about everything and everybody. I mean, she's helped families of the musicians that they've played in, paid for their surgeries, paid for, education of children of the doctor who was the holistic doctor they went to when he passed away. She pretty much made sure his family was okay. Just so many anonymous donations and causes that she's taken on. It said in the beginning of the book that the world would be a different place without Yoko in it, visibly and invisibly. She's done so much.
Yeah, and that makes me think back to the kind of concept art that she's done. And there was some comment about how when John went up the ladder and saw this one piece of art of hers, the first one that he really had seen or attended to, and just the positivity of it made such an impression on him.
Right.
I mean, the thing about everything I've seen that Yoko's done has been so positive, such a degree of optimism and positive feeling in it.
In the face of all the negativity, she just kept strong, and it's not that she ignored the negativity, because she read everything ever written about her as well. She wanted the feedback, and when she sees something horrible, she say, "Oh, they thought of it that way. Oh well." She does always put it. But here, this is her. She's there with Dove of Peace, and there's nothing bad about this woman, and it's just making me so upset that people still carry these grudges based on lies. I don't know.
Do they even remember as much, though? It seems like it's been such a long time, and I run into younger people who don't really quite know who the Beatles were.
No, but my cousin's children said, "Why would you write a book on her?" I'm like, "Oh my God, where are you getting this from?" It's just their parents probably put it in their head, or they're still reading media. They're calling Taylor Swift the Yoko Ono of the football team. It's still a thing.
One thing that always impressed me is she was not shy about going out and protesting when she sees something terrible happening in the world. She got involved with the protests. A lot of artists avoided that. Just, they didn't want the blowback from critics who say, well, they're protesting against the war in Afghanistan or against fracking, and she was active in that.
She led
I
the
was impressed.
campaign against fracking. She was right
Yeah,
there in the front lines.
and that
The
was
Women's
interesting.
March, she was there in a wheelchair.
Yeah, and that took a lot of um, courage because I'm an older person and I don't know that I could be out there in the fields where they're doing those kind of protests, but it didn't seem to stop her.
No, she stood up for it. I mean, she was raised in Japan where you were not even supposed to smile in a photograph, and she was just dying to let go and express herself. And she did it all for the cause of good. She was fighting the good fight all along.
I was just looking at this Taylor Swift Yoko Ono comparison.
Oh, geez.
That seems so strange to me. So I guess they're arguing that Taylor Swift is breaking up a whole football team.
Yeah,
That's
and what's her
pretty
name?
weird.
The married Prince Harry. She's Yoko Ono too because she broke up the royal family. Doesn't make any sense.
Well, it's so unfortunate that Yoko's name would be used in that context when there's so much good and so much powerful work that she's done.
Right.
I mean, I think it's a great thing that you've written this book. How is the book doing? How long has it been in release?
It's maybe 2 years for the soft cover and less than a year for the hardcover, and it's doing great amongst. It's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Library and Archives. Olivia Harrison has recommended it on Instagram. It's in the Beatles gift guide. All the Beatles people at the fest for Beatles fans are really appreciating it. Yoko's family, her colleagues and friends, especially Sean, he told me how much he loves it and appreciates that. They're all saying how much they've learned, even though some of them knew her since the 50s and the 60s. And I've worked on her films. I didn't know this was what it meant. I didn't know all these details. So, and I'm not just putting details for the sake of it. It's just that every detail is so meaningful and important. And it's about the 50s and the 60s and 70s, these magical times where there's so much happening, so much history went down, and amazing, celebrities and all fighting for things that nobody's fighting for now. But, being activists in a time, the first activists, laying down for peace, or I just think that I talk about every album and every song with and without John in the context of the story and not putting it in the back like a discography, because everything, all the lyrics have something to do with what was happening at the time. So it's just a massive undertaking, but it's not a hard read. It's a very refreshing read. It's very enlightening. Just her words of wisdom are there.
The fact that you had to self-publish, sorry, says a lot about the sad state of American book publishing. It's such a great subject, and I know what those editors were probably saying. Well, it's going to be controversy, and people will be saying it's all this nasty stuff about Yoko, and it's like it's not going to
Or they
be
would
that
want
at
me to
all.
say nasty stuff. There was a journalist that there was a beautiful interview that was done in 1974 by Carolyn Coon, a beautiful journalist from England. And she had done this interview and it was unpublished. And I found it somehow, and I asked her permission to use pieces of it. And she said, "Oh, I'm so happy you're going to use this." I said, "Well, why wasn't this published?" She said, "Well, the magazine told me I had to dirty it up. I had to say how she abandoned her daughter and how she turned John onto heroin, and I just wouldn't do it." And I'm like, thank God somebody had the integrity not to do it.
That's just sad that you know creative people have to deal with that. It's like if you have a great product, whether it's music or a book or straight journalism, you know the fact that you have to dirty it up. You hear that a lot. You hear that in music too. It's like it's not enough dirty words in your song. You'll never be a punk. And then
Well, the
folks
thing
just
is,
didn't do that.
most lives, I suppose, even celebrities' lives, they might be a little interesting, but to fill an entire book and make every page exciting is probably not possible unless you throw in some sensationalism. But Yoko's life, every minute of every day was like jam-packed with action, and whether it was turmoil or something wonderful, it writes itself. I didn't have to put any crazy details in there that weren't true. So that's the beauty of it. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story.
You should mention where people can go to buy the book.
Sure. So you can get it on Amazon worldwide. If you want a signed copy, it's only available at conceptualbooks.com. And this hardcover version is only at conceptualbooks.com. And I can sign this as well. So that's it. You can go in a bookstore and order it. They probably won't put it on a shelf because it's not published by, Faber and Faber or some famous publisher. But
The usual suspects.
yeah, it's in their system. They can order it. You have to ask for it by name. And this artwork is by an Australian artist called Kat McInnes, and Yoko loved it too. So that's why I have it on the cover.
Right. Well, we have reached the end of the hour, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and hope you'll come back sometime and talk more about rock and roll.
I certainly will, anytime.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, too.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.